The day Gideon Vane stood in the middle of Red Willow Crossing's winter market and pointed his gloved finger at Mara Ellsworth, she felt something inside her chest go completely still. Not afraid, not humiliated, just still. "Tell me, Rourke," Gideon called out, loud enough for every merchant, every rancher, every woman clutching her children's hands to hear clearly. "You really intend to marry a woman who can't give you a single heir? Who'll leave your name buried in the dirt the day you die?" The crowd went quiet, and Mara stood there, holding a bag of flowers she'd never get to pay for, feeling 50 pairs of eyes land on her like stones. If you were standing in her boots that morning, what would you have done? Before we go any further, if stories like this one move something in you, please hit that subscribe button right now and turn on your notifications. Every week we bring you stories about ordinary people facing extraordinary moments, and we don't want you to miss a single one. Drop a comment below and tell us what city or country you're watching from. I genuinely love seeing how far these stories travel. And if this one speaks to your heart, tap that like button. It means more than you know. Now let's go back to where it truly began. Mara Ellsworth did not set out to become the woman people pitied. That was the thing nobody understood about her. Not the women at the dry goods store who lowered their voices when she walked past. Not the old ranchers who shook their heads whenever her name came up at the feed mill, and certainly not Gideon Vane, who had built an entire strategy around the assumption that Mara's loneliness made her weak. She had been 24 years old the first time a doctor sat across from her and used the word unlikely in a sentence about her future. His name was Dr. Harold Poole, and he was a tired man with ink-stained fingers and a manner of speaking that left no room for softness. He had ridden 3 days to reach Red Willow Crossing because the fever had spread through half the settlement that autumn, and by the time he reached the Ellsworth homestead, Mara had been burning up for 11 days straight. She survived. Most people were glad about that. Her father had wept. Her mother had pressed both palms flat against the kitchen table and breathed like a woman who'd just pulled herself out of deep water. The neighbors who had helped bring in the last of the harvest while Mara was bedridden brought pies and preserves for a week afterward. But Dr. Poole, before he climbed back onto his horse and headed south, had pulled Mara's mother aside and said something. Mara had only caught pieces of it through the thin cabin wall words like inflammation and damage and probable in children. And when her mother came back inside, her face had rearranged itself into something carefully neutral, the way a woman arranges furniture after a funeral. Mara never asked her mother directly what the doctor had said. She didn't need to. Some things settle into a person's understanding without explanation, the way frost settles into ground before you've seen a single snowflake. By the time Mara was 25, she had stopped entertaining the idea of courtship. Not dramatically, not with weeping or declarations. She simply allowed that door in her mind to swing quietly shut, and then she picked up an axe and went back to splitting wood, because the wood still needed splitting regardless of what kind of future a doctor thought she deserved. 7 years later, she was still splitting wood. Her ranch sat 3 miles outside of Red Willow Crossing at the end of a road that turned brutal in mud season and nearly impassable in winter. She ran a small operation, 8 horses she'd bred or rescued, a kitchen garden that supplied more than she could eat alone, a barn she'd rebuilt almost entirely by herself after the north wall caved during a bad storm 2 winters back. People in town occasionally marveled at what she'd managed to hold together without a husband. They said it with a kind of reluctant respect that always came bundled with something that felt a lot like condescension. Remarkable what that Ellsworth woman does on her own. Shame she never married. Must be lonely, a woman like that. Mara heard all of it. Small towns were not quiet places, regardless of how much open land surrounded them. Gossip moved through Red Willow, crossing the way. Water moved through limestone slowly, persistently, finding every crack. She had learned to ignore it, or at least she had learned to look like she was ignoring it, which was close enough. The morning Silas Rourke first appeared at the edge of her property, Mara was out mending a section of fence along her eastern pasture. It was early enough that the light was still flat and gray, and her breath was coming out in small clouds, and she was not in the mood for visitors. She'd been not in the mood for visitors for approximately 7 years, which was a stretch of time she preferred not to examine too closely. She heard the horse before she saw the man, a sound that was wrong somehow, uneven, the kind of rhythm that made an experienced horsewoman set down her tools and look up. The gelding coming down the road was a dark bay, and it was favoring its right foreleg badly. The man on its back was already dismounting before she'd fully registered him, his hand running down the animal's shoulder with the automatic attention of someone who had been around horses long enough to read their pain without asking. Mara watched him for a moment. He wasn't from Red Willow Crossing, she was certain of that. She knew everybody in this county and most of their horses, and neither this man nor this animal was familiar to her. "Front right," she called out, not because she needed to explain herself, but because standing silent while a man examined a lame horse on the edge of her property felt stranger than speaking. He looked up. He had a weathered face, the kind built by years of outdoor work rather than age, with dark eyes that registered her without making any particular event out of it. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "Stone bruise, I think. Hoping he can rest a while before I push on." Mara considered him. He wasn't asking for water. He wasn't asking for anything, actually, which was unusual. Most people who stopped at her gate were already building a request before they finished their sentence. "Water troughs on the other side of the barn," she said. Gates unlocked. She picked up her fence tool and went back to work. She heard him lead the horse through the gate, heard the animal drink, heard the man move quietly around the yard, and heard none of the things she'd half expected: no attempts at conversation, no lingering at the fence line to watch her work, no commentary about a woman alone on a ranch this size. He watered the horse, rested it for what she judged to be about 30 minutes, and then she heard the gelding's hoofbeats on the road again, moving south. He didn't say goodbye. She didn't look up. That was the end of it, she assumed. She was wrong. He came back 4 days later with the same horse, which was moving better, and this time he had a work apron folded over the saddle horn. "Found this hanging on the fence post about a half-mile south," he said, when she walked out to meet him. "Figured it was yours." Mara looked at the apron. She hadn't even realized she'd left it there. She'd been mending that same fence line, and she must have set it down and walked away without thinking. "Thank you," she said. She took the apron. She waited for him to say something else, to use the errand as an opening for conversation, to lean against the fence and start telling her about himself, the way men sometimes did when they'd decided to be interesting at a woman. He didn't. He touched the brim of his hat, turned his horse, and rode on. Mara stood in her yard holding the apron and feeling, for the first time in a long time, genuinely puzzled by another human being. She asked around, quietly, without making it obvious that she was asking. His name was Silas Rourke. He'd come up from Wyoming 6 weeks earlier, had taken a position training horses for the Caldwell operation about 12 miles east. Nobody knew much else about him. He was quiet, kept to himself, did his work without complaint. The woman at the dry goods store said she'd seen him in town twice, and he'd paid for his goods and left without lingering, which she seemed to find slightly suspicious. Mara found it nothing of the sort. The third time he appeared at her gate was because her gate itself had stopped working, one of the hinges had given out, and the whole structure was listing badly to the left. She had noticed it the day before, and had already mentally added it to the list of repairs that needed doing before winter, which was a list that grew longer every year, and shorter only through sheer stubbornness. She came outside to find Silas Rourke crouched at the base of the gate, examining the hinge, his horse tied a few feet away. "I didn't ask for help with that," she said, not unkindly. Just factually. "No," he agreed. "You didn't." He straightened up and looked at the gate, not at her. "Bolts sheared through. I've got a replacement in my saddlebag. Won't take 20 minutes. Mara looked at the gate. She looked at him. She was quite capable of replacing the bolt herself once she rode into town and bought one, which would take most of a morning and cost her half a day's work, and they both knew it, and neither of them said so. "Fine," she said. He fixed the gate in 18 minutes. He did it without talking, without asking where she kept her tools, without making her feel like she was being done a favor. When he was finished, he swung the gate twice to test the movement, made a small adjustment, and then stepped back. "That'll hold," he said. "Thank you," she said. "Silas Rourke," he said, and held out his hand. "I know who you are," she said, but she shook it. "Mara Ellsworth." "I know who you are," he said, and there was nothing pointed in it, no implication, just a plain return of her own words. She almost smiled. She caught it before it became visible. He left without further discussion. After that, the visits had no fixed pattern, which Mara came to understand was deliberate on his part, though she couldn't have explained how she knew that. He didn't come on the same days. He didn't arrive with a plan. He came when he was passing, or when he noticed something that needed doing on the road near her property, or once memorably during a windstorm when he appeared out of nowhere to help her chase down a section of roof tarpaulin before it wrapped itself around the horse fence and frightened the animals. That evening, they had sat on her porch afterward while the wind moved through the valley below them, and for the first time they had actually talked. Not about anything of consequence: horses, weather, the peculiar geography of this part of Montana, the way the mountains looked different at dusk than at any other hour. Mara noticed that he listened to her the way people listened when they were actually interested, not just waiting for their own turn to speak. She noticed other things too, carefully and against her better judgment. She noticed that he never asked about her past and never seemed to be working up to asking. She noticed that when she disagreed with something he said, he considered her point instead of dismissing it. She noticed that when he looked at her, it was directly, without the particular awkwardness men sometimes showed around a woman they considered damaged or difficult. She told herself this meant nothing. She was good at telling herself things meant nothing. Years of practice, but the lie was getting harder to maintain. The first time she understood she was in real trouble was the evening he came to return a horse blanket she'd lent him after his gelding had taken a chill. He came at dusk, which was later than his usual visits, and she was making supper, and she invited him in without thinking about it, just opened the door wider and stepped back. The way you do with someone whose presence has become natural before you've noticed it becoming natural. He sat at her kitchen table and drank coffee while she finished cooking, and they talked about nothing important, and then they ate together, and it was the most ordinary thing imaginable. That was what frightened her, not that it was strange. That it wasn't. 3 days later, she made herself sit down and have a very specific, very honest conversation with herself. The kind of conversation most people avoided because it required looking at things they'd spent years carefully not looking at. She was becoming attached to Silas Rourke, and she could not allow that to continue. She had built her life around a single, foundational understanding of what she was, a woman who had been told, clearly, by a medical professional with no reason to lie, that she would very probably never have children. She had accepted that verdict not with surrender, but with a kind of quiet practicality. It was a fact. Facts did not change because you wished them different. And because she was a decent person who did not want to deceive anyone, she had drawn a line around herself. Stay inside the line. No courtship, no false starts, no allowing a man to walk into her life, only to eventually realize that what she couldn't offer him mattered more than what she could. It was, she had always believed, the honest thing to do. The only problem was that nobody had asked her to draw that line. Silas Rourke specifically had never once asked her anything that required it. He had not come to her ranch looking for a wife or an heir or a woman who could give him a future that looked a particular way. He had come back for 100 small reasons: a gate, a blanket, a lost apron, and somewhere in the accumulation of all those small things, something had grown between them that Mara did not have a name for, or rather did have a name for and was deeply reluctant to use. She started finding reasons to be unavailable, to be out in the back pasture when he might come by, to finish chores before the hours when he typically appeared, to be, in the plainest possible terms, someone who was difficult to find. Silas noticed. He did not pretend he hadn't. One afternoon he appeared at the fence while she was working with a young mare and waited until she looked up. When she did, he said, simply and without accusation, "Did I do something wrong?" The question hit her somewhere she hadn't expected. "No," she said. "Are you sure?" "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. The mare shifted under Mara's hand. "All right," he said. "And then I'll still come by when I'm passing. Not to push. Just because I still am passing," he left. And Mara stood in the middle of her pasture with her hand flat against the mare's neck, and she felt something that she had told herself she was finished feeling, the dull, specific ache of wanting something she'd decided she wasn't allowed to want. It was the wrong moment to feel it, and she was becoming terribly afraid, already much too late to stop. The season turned toward winter. The days shortened. The cold came in off the mountains in a way that made the whole world feel smaller and harder and more determined to endure. And somewhere in those weeks, Gideon Vane had begun asking questions about Mara Ellsworth's land questions that started at the county recorder's office and ended, as all of Gideon's questions eventually did, at a conclusion that benefited Gideon Vane. Mara didn't know about any of that yet. She was too busy trying to maintain the careful distance she'd constructed between herself and Silas Rourke, who kept passing her road, who kept not demanding anything of her, who, had she would realize later, already changed something in her that could not be changed back. The snow came early that year, which the old-timers in Red Willow Crossing said meant a hard winter, and the old-timers were not wrong. By the third week of November, Mara had already moved the horses into the barn for overnight stays, already reinforced the feed stores, already checked and rechecked every seam of the barn roof with the obsessive thoroughness of a woman who knew exactly what she stood to lose if something failed. She worked faster in cold weather, always had. There was something about the bite of it that organized her mind, cleared out the noise, left only the task in front of her hands. The noise she most needed clearing out, those weeks, had a name. She hadn't seen Silas in 12 days. She had counted, which bothered her, because counting days was something you only did when days mattered more than you wanted them to. She told herself the weather had kept him away. It was a reasonable explanation. The road to the Caldwell operation ran north through a low pass that became genuinely treacherous in early ice, and a man with any sense chose his travel carefully when the ground was unpredictable beneath his horse's feet. She told herself this, and mostly believed it during the daylight hours, when there was enough work to fill every available space in her head. The nights were harder. She wasn't sleeping well, which she refused to examine too closely. She lay in the dark, listening to the wind come off the mountains, and told herself she was listening for sounds from the barn, which was technically true and also completely beside the point. There were sounds in her head that had nothing to do with the barn, the specific low register of Silas Rourke's voice, the way he said her name with no particular inflection, and yet somehow made it sound like a thing worth saying. The particular quality of the silence between them that had never once been uncomfortable. She was 31 years old, and she had managed 7 years without this kind of trouble. She deeply resented being unable to manage it now. It was into this mood, sharp-edged, restless, poorly rested, that Alma Greer arrived on a Thursday morning with a covered basket and an expression that meant she had information she considered both urgent and charitable to deliver. Alma was the wife of the man who ran Red Willow Crossing's only feed mill. She was not a malicious woman. That was the thing Mara always had to remind herself. Alma was not malicious. She was merely unable to encounter a piece of information without passing it along, the same way some people were unable to see a stone without picking it up. "I brought you some preserves," Alma said, setting the basket on Mara's kitchen table with the practiced ease of someone who had decided the visit was already welcome. "The apple ones you like, thank you," Mara said. She put the kettle on. It was easier than asking Alma to leave, and asking Alma to leave had never actually worked anyway. They sat. Alma talked about the early snow and the price of flour and the Hendersons' new baby, and Mara listened with the patient surface of a woman who had learned to let conversation move past her like water, taking nothing away. Then Alma set down her cup and folded her hands on the table, which was a gesture Mara recognized as the real beginning. I heard something in town, Alma said, about Gideon Vane. Mara kept her expression still. He's usually doing something worth hearing about. He's been asking questions at the county office about property lines. About yours specifically. Alma hesitated, which was unusual for her. There's talk about a railroad coming through, a spur line, they're saying, that would connect up north to the main trunk. And the corridor they're considering, it runs right along your eastern pasture. Mara was quiet for a moment. The kettle began to whisper on the stove. He wants to buy me out, she said. It wasn't a question. He wants the land whether you sell or not, is what I'm hearing. Alma looked uncomfortable. He's already bought the picket place and the old Harmon acreage. Yours would put him in control of about 4 miles of the corridor. That's Mara. That's an enormous amount of money we're talking about. If the railroad comes through. My land's not for sale, Mara said. Alma nodded slowly. She looked like she had more to say but wasn't sure which container to put it in. Finally, he's been asking other things too about you. The kettle boiled. Mara got up and dealt with it carefully, her back to Alma. What kinds of things, she said. Flat. Not a question either. Personal things. Alma's voice dropped to the register women used when they were conveying something they found distasteful but too interesting to withhold. About why you never married. About what the doctor said years ago after the fever. Mara set the teapot down on the counter very deliberately, making sure she set it down and did not slam it. And how would Gideon Vane know what any doctor said to me? She said. Dr. Poole's boy handles records for the county now. He's young and he's well. Gideon's generous with men who are young and need money and don't think very carefully about what they're giving away. Mara turned around. She looked at Alma, who had the grace to look ashamed of something, though Mara wasn't sure exactly what. You're telling me, Mara said slowly, that Gideon Vane has been spreading my private medical history around this town. Not Alma stopped. I don't know how widely. I'm telling you what I heard because I thought you should know. Because I think he plans to use it. She pressed her lips together. There's also talk about you and Silas Rourke. Mara said nothing. People have noticed he comes by your place, Alma said. And Gideon, he's been saying things. That Rourke is a fool. That a cowboy who wants a future ought to think about what kind of woman he's choosing. She looked at the table. He's saying it with a smile, the way he says everything. Like he's just making conversation. Mara sat back down at the table. She wrapped both hands around her cup. She was aware that her hands wanted to shake, and she was not allowing it. Thank you for telling me, she said, and she meant it, genuinely, even though every word Alma had just delivered felt like a stone dropped into still water, ripples spreading out to edges she couldn't see yet. After Alma left, Mara sat at that table for a long time without moving. The wind moved outside. One of the mares shifted in the barn, and she could hear it through the walls. Everything else was very quiet. She thought about Silas. She thought about what it would mean for him if Gideon Vane turned the weight of this community's judgment on the question of what Silas Rourke was doing, courting a woman like Mara Ellsworth. She thought about what it would cost him not immediately, but slowly, the way reputations eroded in small towns, one sideways glance and withheld handshake at a time. She thought about how men like Gideon Vane operated not with force, not directly, but by shifting the air around a person until everything became harder to breathe. And she made a decision. It was the wrong decision. She would understand that later, fully and completely. But at the time, sitting at her kitchen table in the gray November light, with the feeling of 12 days of absence still sitting uncomfortable in her chest, it felt like the only honest thing available to her. She decided to make the distance she'd been building between herself and Silas Rourke permanent. It would be cleaner, she told herself, kinder. If she let this end before it became something that couldn't end cleanly, she would be saving them both from a harder thing later. She was not capable of giving him what men eventually wanted. She had known this for 7 years. The fact that Silas had never asked for it didn't mean the asking wasn't coming. She was still sitting there, when she heard a horse on the road. She knew the sound of his gelding by then. She hadn't meant to learn it, but she had, and recognizing it now felt like a betrayal of the decision she'd just made. She stayed where she was. She let him knock. After a moment, she got up and opened the door because her mother had raised her to open her door, and that particular piece of upbringing was apparently stronger than her intention to disappear. Silas stood on her porch. He had snow on his shoulders and in his hat, and he looked cold, which was a reasonable condition given that it was snowing. He was holding a small wrapped package that turned out, when he offered it, to be a new set of harness buckles, the kind she'd mentioned once, in passing, were wearing out on her driving rig. "Happened to see them at the hardware," he said. "Thought you might need them before winter proper." Mara looked at the package. She looked at him. Something in her chest was conducting its own conversation entirely separate from the one her mind was trying to have. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "No," he agreed. She should have said thank you and closed the door. She opened it wider. They sat at the table she'd been sitting at alone for the past hour, and he drank the coffee she poured without remarking on the fact that she'd clearly already been sitting there a while. He talked about the Caldwell horses, about a particularly difficult colt that had decided to make the last 3 weeks as complicated as possible. She listened. She laughed once, which she hadn't planned on doing. Then she made herself say the things she'd decided to say. "Silas." She stopped, started again. "I think you should stop coming by." He was quiet. He set down his cup. He didn't look hurt, which she found both a relief and somehow more difficult to face than hurt would have been. "Why," he said, "not okay, or of course, or even I understand." "Just why?" "Because I think we've been." She stopped again. The words felt dishonest even as she was forming them, which was the problem with having decided to do the honest thing. "I'm not, I can't offer you." She stopped a third time, furious with herself. "Mara," his voice was quiet. Not soft. Silas Rourke was not a soft man, but careful. "You don't have to talk around it. If there's something you want to say to me, say it." She looked at him directly. It was harder than it should have been. "I was sick years ago," she said, "when I was 24. The fever. The doctor told my mother, told me that I would probably never have children." She watched his face. Nothing moved in it, which was not the same as nothing happening in it. "I'm telling you this because I think you deserve to know it, and because I think Gideon Vane may be about to make sure the whole town knows it if you and I." She gestured vaguely between them, a gesture that failed to capture what she meant and probably captured more than she intended. "I don't want you caught in the middle of whatever he's planning." Silas was quiet for a long moment, long enough that the wind outside became audible again. "Is that all?" he said finally. Mara stared at him. "Is that, Silas? Did you hear what I said?" "I heard you," he said. "I'm asking if that's the whole reason, or if there's something else." She felt something move through her that she couldn't fully name. Frustration, and something that was almost gratitude, and something else that was just fear, plain and uncomplicated. "Isn't that enough?" she said. "Not for me to stop coming by, no," he said. "Not if the only reason is a doctor's guess from 7 years ago and something Gideon Vane might or might not do." He looked at her steadily. "Now, if you're telling me you don't want me here, that's different." "I'll respect that, but that's not what you said." Mara opened her mouth. "Closed it. You're being unreasonably difficult," she said. "Probably," he said without particular apology. They sat there looking at each other across the kitchen table, and outside the snow was picking up, and neither of them said anything else for a moment that went on long enough to become its own kind of statement. Then Silas picked up his coffee cup and drank the rest of it, and Mara looked out the window, and they both pretended the previous 3 minutes had been an ordinary conversation, which they both knew it hadn't been. He left an hour later. He did not say he would be back. He also did not say he wouldn't. Mara stood at her kitchen window and watched him ride down the road until the snow took him, and she thought, "This is getting away from me entirely." She was not wrong. The weeks that followed moved the way hard weeks always move, not quickly and not slowly, but with a relentless forward pressure. like a river in high water that carries everything in its path without particular interest in where any individual thing ends up. Mara worked her ranch with the same stubborn dailiness she'd always brought to it. She fixed things when they broke, fed what needed feeding, rode the fence lines when the weather permitted, stayed close to the barn when it didn't. She went to town once a week for supplies and came home as quickly as she reasonably could. She noticed the change in how people looked at her, though she cataloged it quietly and without comment. There had always been a species of community sympathy aimed at her, the tolerant, slightly patronizing regard people held for a woman who had chosen a hard life, but this was different. This was curiosity with an edge to it, glances that held a second too long. Conversations that stopped when she came within earshot and resumed at a lower register after she passed. Gideon Vane was doing what Alma had warned her he'd do. He was not doing it loudly. He was far too sophisticated for loudness. He was doing it the way he did everything with a word here, a knowing look there, a sympathetic shake of his head among the right men at the right moments. Poor Rourke, good man. Shame someone hadn't told him sooner. That kind of thing. Delivered with the apparent regret of a man who hated to see anyone make a mistake, which was the particular brand of cruelty that was most difficult to confront because it wore kindness as clothing. Mara confronted it anyway, in the only way available to her, which was to walk through town with her head level, and her expression composed, and buy her flour and her harness oil, and say good morning to everyone she passed, including the women who had stopped including her in their conversations, including the men who looked away when she came near. She said good morning because she was not going to give Gideon Vane or anyone else the satisfaction of watching her fold. But it cost her. Everything costs something, and pretending otherwise is just another kind of spending. Silas, for his part, continued to come by the ranch. Not as frequently, the weather and the Caldwell operation gave him genuine reasons to stay close to his own work, but regularly enough that Mara understood he had made a decision about it and was not interested in revising that decision based on external pressure. She found this both infuriating and the most quietly meaningful thing anyone had done for her in a very long time, which told her more about the last 7 years than she was comfortable knowing. They didn't talk about what Gideon was doing. It sat between them like a piece of furniture they'd both agreed not to bump into, present and acknowledged by its deliberate avoidance. They talked about other things. The colt at Caldwell that had finally stopped trying to remove Silas from any surface he'd climbed onto. The horse Mara had taken in the previous spring, a gray mare someone had abandoned on the road east of town that had turned out to be more work than she'd anticipated, and also the most athletic animal on her property. Whether the early snow really did mean a harder winter, and what the older ranchers understood about weather that the younger ones hadn't learned yet. One afternoon, Silas helped her move a load of timber she'd been putting off moving alone because it genuinely required more than one person, though she'd been planning to attempt it regardless. They worked in the kind of silence that had become comfortable between them, not empty, just quiet. The way silence is with someone whose presence doesn't require constant filling. At one point, she was climbing down from the stacked timber, and her boot slipped, and his hand was at her elbow before she'd registered it moving, and she caught herself on the wood and straightened up, and neither of them made any particular event of it. But his hand stayed at her elbow for a second after she'd steadied herself. Just 1 second, and Mara was intensely aware of it, and then it was gone, and they went back to work. She thought about that second for 3 days afterward, which was she was willing to admit privately, to herself. In the dark, not something you thought about if the only feeling involved was gratitude for not falling down. The thing about Gideon Vane, the thing Mara had understood from the first moment she'd heard his name attached to questions about her land, was that he operated on patience. He was not a man who moved quickly. He was a man who arranged conditions and then waited for conditions to do his work for him. He had more money than most of the county and more time than almost anyone. And he had spent both over many years building a particular kind of influence, the kind that didn't look like power from the outside, but felt exactly like it from the inside. He came to see her himself in late November. She was not surprised. She had been expecting him, and she was ready, or as ready as a person could be, for someone who made her feel like a problem he was graciously offering to solve. He arrived in the early afternoon with one of his men waiting back on the road, which was a choice, the man back on the road. A reminder, Gideon himself was well dressed for a ranch visit, which meant he was not a man who worked with his hands and did not especially want anyone to forget it. He had a broad, square face with the kind of open expression that people often mistook for friendliness because they'd never seen it not working toward something. "Miss Ellsworth," he said, with the warmth of a man who knew exactly how much warmth to deploy. "I hope I'm not interrupting," you are, Mara said. "What do you want?" He smiled, not offended. Gideon Vane was never genuinely offended by women who failed to be charmed by him. It just reorganized his approach. "I've been hoping we could have a civil conversation about your eastern pasture land." "I think you've heard I'm interested." "I've heard," she said. "It's not for sale." "Everything's for sale at the right number," he said, still pleasant. "Not everything," she said, "and not this." He looked at her for a moment with something that was not quite respect, but was its close cousin the acknowledgement one strategic mind gave to another when the opening was blocked. "I want to be straightforward with you," he said, which was always what men said before they were not straightforward. "I'm going to be building along that corridor one way or another. The question is whether your property is part of something profitable or whether it ends up squeezed between operations that make it very difficult to run as a ranch." He paused. "It would be better for you financially, practically, if we came to an agreement before that situation develops." Mara looked at him steadily. "Is that a threat, Mr. Vane?" "It's an assessment," he said, "of conditions." "Then let me give you my assessment," she said. "This is my land. I built what's on it with my own hands, and I intend to keep building it with my own hands for as long as I'm standing. Whatever you're planning for that corridor, you'll plan it around me." She held the door, clearly indicating she was done with the conversation. "Have a safe ride back to town." He left. He was still smiling when he left, which was the thing about Gideon Vane. His smile had nothing to do with how he felt. It was just something his face did while he was thinking. Mara closed the door and stood inside it for a moment, with her hand still on the latch, and she thought, that man is going to make the winter very long. She was more right than she knew. December arrived with a cold that settled into the valley like something permanent, the kind of cold that made even the horses irritable. Mara had long since completed her winter preparations and had moved into the particular routine of hard-season ranch life, abbreviated, functional, stripped of everything that wasn't necessary. She slept more. She cooked simple things. She read by lamplight in the evenings, which was the closest she came to rest. Silas came by on a Saturday when the temperature had dropped sharply, but before the next system had moved in. He brought a smoked ham from the Caldwell smokehouse, which was something he'd clearly arranged in advance rather than stumbled across, and they ate together in her kitchen and talked. And at some point during the meal, Mara noticed that she had stopped editing herself in his presence. Not completely, she was still Mara Ellsworth, and some degree of reserve was built into her character the way grain was built into wood. But she was saying things she'd thought, rather than things she'd filtered, and she was laughing without calculating it. And when their conversation wandered into territory she hadn't meant to enter her mother, her childhood. The particular loneliness of the years after the fever, she didn't route around it the way she normally would have. She just let it happen. Afterward, she wasn't sure what to do with that. He had gone quiet when she talked about those years. Not the silence of discomfort, but of actually listening. When she finished, he said, "You got yourself through a lot of hard years pretty much alone." Not as a compliment, not as pity, just as a fact he was acknowledging. "I did," she said. "You still are," he said, and looked at her directly, and she wasn't sure exactly what he meant by it, but she felt it in the particular way you feel something that's almost too true. She changed the subject. She was not ready for the full territory of what that look meant, not yet. She needed more time to build up to the honesty of it, and she suspected he understood that, because he let her change the subject without resistance. He left at dusk. She stood at the window again after, which was becoming a pattern she hadn't approved. The storm came the second week of December. It announced itself 2 days in advance with the kind of sky that experienced Montana people read the way a sailor reads water, a specific gray, a specific weight, a stillness in the air that was not peaceful but preparatory. Mara moved everything that needed moving, stored what needed storing, made sure her fuel supply was adequate, and her water supply was not going to freeze in the first night. She was not expecting company. She was not expecting specifically to hear a horse struggling on her road in the early evening of the second day. When the snow had already come down 4 inches and the light had gone and the temperature had dropped to the kind of serious cold that turned roads treacherous and erased the line between where road ended and ditch began. She heard the animal before she heard anything else. The particular sound of a horse in distress, not injured, she thought, but exhausted and frightened by uncertain footing, fighting against conditions rather than moving through them. She put on her coat and took a lantern and went out without particularly deciding to, because horses in trouble operated on her nervous system like a fire bell. The gelding was at the edge of her gate, and Silas was on the ground beside it, one hand on the animal's neck, one boot planted in snow that came up past his ankle. He had clearly dismounted when the horse had started to lose confidence on the ice beneath the snow, and he looked cold in a way that went past cold, the specific look of someone who had been fighting weather for longer than was comfortable. "Come inside," she said. It was not an invitation with conditions attached. It was just the only sentence that mattered. "I can make it back to—" He started. "Silas." She looked at him. She looked at the horse. She looked at the road behind him, which was already white and obliterated. "You can't make it back anywhere tonight. Come inside." He looked at the road. He was a practical man, and practical men, when confronted with clear evidence, eventually adjusted their position. "All right," he said. They got the horse into the barn, which took 20 minutes and some convincing on the gelding's part. Mara gave the animal a stall, feed, and a dry blanket, working with the efficiency of someone who had dealt with cold and frightened horses many times, and understood that the most useful thing you could be in those moments was calm and competent. Silas worked alongside her without direction, picking up what needed doing without being asked, which she noticed, and filed away. They went inside. She hung his coat by the stove, and he stood in her kitchen dripping melted snow onto the floorboards and looking slightly sheepish about the entire situation. "Coffee," she said. "Thank you," he said. They sat at the kitchen table, her kitchen table, the table that had hosted all the most honest conversations of the last several months, while the storm built itself into something loud and serious outside. And the warmth of the stove worked its way into the room, and Mara came to the gradual understanding that this was going to be a long night. She got up and checked the fire twice, checked the window twice, made more coffee, and eventually made a second supper, because neither of them had eaten much, and the cold had burned through whatever reserves they'd started with. They ate. The wind outside grew serious enough to rattle the windows in their frames. "I'm sorry about this," he said at some point. "You didn't make the weather," she said. "I should have stayed at Caldwell. Why didn't you?" He was quiet for a moment. "I was coming to see you," he said. Simply, without decoration. Mara looked at her coffee cup. "The storm had already started when you left. It was just snow," he said. "It moved faster than I expected." She looked up at him. He was watching her without apology, which was how he watched her most of the time, and she had reached the point where she could no longer convince herself that the effect of it was something other than what it clearly was. "You should have waited," she said. "Probably," he said. "You could have been badly hurt on that road. I know that." "Then why?" She stopped. "Because I wanted to see you," he said. "And I knew if I waited for a better day, there would be another reason to wait, and then another. And I've gotten the impression you're pretty good at finding reasons to wait." Mara felt something shift in her chest, not painfully, more like something that had been held in a fixed position for a very long time, suddenly becoming capable of moving. "That's fair," she said quietly. I'm not saying it to be harsh, he said. I understand why. I think I understand it pretty well by now. She looked at him across the kitchen table, and outside the storm was loud enough that the world beyond her walls had effectively ceased to exist for the night, and she thought, there is nowhere to go from here except forward. So she told him everything, not the way she'd told him before the clipped, careful version with its managed edges. She told him the real version. She told him what it had been like to be 24 years old and hear a piece of information through a cabin wall that reorganized everything she'd believed about her own future. She told him about the quiet grief of it, which she'd never called grief to anyone because it felt self-indulgent to mourn something you'd never actually had. She told him about the 7 years of building a life around the decision that this was her shape, solitary, self-sufficient, complete, without the things she'd been told she probably couldn't have. She told him that she had been genuinely at peace with most of it, that the peace was real, not performed. She told him that it had stopped being sufficient about the same time a man with a lame horse had appeared at the edge of her fence line. When she finished, the fire had burned lower and the storm outside was at its worst, shaking the walls with a force that was almost conversational. And Silas was watching her with an expression she couldn't fully read, which was not the same as not feeling it. I don't know what happens with all of that, she said. I don't know what I can offer you that. Mara, he said. And then he stopped and seemed to decide that whatever he'd been about to say should come differently, and he looked at the table for a moment and then back at her. I didn't come back to your ranch the first time because I was looking for someone particular. I didn't come back the second or the third time because I had a plan. I came back because being here felt like the most honest place I'd been in a long time. She said nothing. You're asking me to weigh something, he said. But I already know the weight of it. I knew it before tonight. He looked at her steadily. It doesn't change what I want. The fire settled. The storm held. Mara sat at her kitchen table across from a man she had tried, sincerely and repeatedly, to keep at a manageable distance and felt the distance collapse entirely. She didn't say anything for a long time, but she didn't look away either. You're going to make this very complicated, she said finally. Probably, he said, and there was something almost gentle in it. Outside the storm continued its argument with the mountains, loud and relentless. Inside, the fire worked steadily against the cold, and two people sat at a kitchen table in the long, honest quiet of something that had already been decided, even if neither of them had said so yet in the exact words. And in the morning, when the storm had exhausted itself, and the world outside was white and still and absolutely without precedent for its own beauty, Mara Ellsworth made coffee and watched the snow, and felt for the first time in 7 years the particular terrifying weight of a future she had not yet decided to refuse. The morning after the storm was the kind of morning that made you understand why people had stayed in Montana, despite everything Montana regularly did to them. Mara stood at her kitchen window with her second cup of coffee and looked at a world that had been entirely remade overnight. The snow had come down 2 feet, maybe more in the drifts, and the valley below her property was white and absolute, the kind of white that had no gray in it, that absorbed the pale winter light and gave it back doubled. The mountains to the north were invisible behind their own weather. Everything closed: the barn, the fence lines, the water trough with its thick cap of ice, was still and clean and temporary looking. The way things looked after a storm, when you knew the mud and the damage would reveal themselves later, but right now there was just this. Silas had slept in the barn. She had offered him the extra room, which had felt like the honest thing to do given the temperature, and he had thanked her and said the barn was fine, which she had understood to be his way of not complicating a situation that was already complicated enough, without adding the particular weight of a man sleeping 20 feet from her bedroom door. She hadn't argued. She had given him 2 extra blankets and a lantern, and they had said goodnight with the specific formality of 2 people who were very aware of each other, and were deliberately choosing to be careful about it. She heard him in the barn now movement, the low sound of his voice, talking to the horses the way people talk to animals when they thought no one was listening. She recognized the tone, if not the words. It was the same tone she used, low and continuous and unremarkable. She had never talked to an animal with an audience before, and it hadn't occurred to her until this moment that Silas Rourke probably hadn't either. She put on her coat and went out to help with the morning. They worked side by side in the barn for an hour without talking much. There was a comfortable, practical order to it. She knew her animals and her routines. He read both quickly and fit himself into the spaces without disrupting anything. The gray mare took to him immediately, which Mara noted without commenting on, because the gray mare was a notoriously suspicious animal and her approval was not easily given. "She likes you," Mara said, when the mare pressed her nose against Silas's shoulder for the third time. "She likes the carrots I have in my pocket," he said. "She can tell the difference," Mara said. "Trust me." He looked at the mare, and then at Mara, and something moved across his face that was almost amusement, but was warmer than that. After the barn, they cleared the path from the house to the water trough, which required shoveling and some discussion about technique that became briefly heated because they had different philosophies about the most efficient approach, and neither of them was accustomed to deferring to another person's method. Silas won the argument by virtue of being slightly taller, and therefore able to throw snow further, which Mara acknowledged was a practical advantage she was not going to concede, was also a correct one. She made breakfast. He ate it without ceremony, which she appreciated. She could not have tolerated someone who made an event of being fed. "The road should be passable by afternoon," she said. Not pushing him out, just stating a fact. "I'll head back to Caldwell when it is," he said. Same register, just information. They sat with that for a moment. "Last night," Mara said. She stopped. She was not usually someone who struggled with the beginning of sentences. "You don't have to say anything about last night," he said. "I want to." She looked at her coffee. I don't regret telling you those things. "I want you to know that. I was afraid afterward that I might, and I don't." He nodded. He seemed to understand that she was working through something and that the work needed to happen without interruption. "I'm not sure what comes next," she said. "I'm not sure I know how to do whatever this is. I've been alone a long time, and I'm not saying that as an excuse. I'm saying it as an honest accounting of where I'm standing." "I know where you're standing," he said. And I'm not going anywhere," he said. "That's not a demand. I'm not asking you to decide something today. I'm just telling you where I am." Mara looked at him across the breakfast table. She thought about the 7 years she'd spent making the interior of her life very small and very manageable. She thought about how much energy it had taken to maintain that smallness, energy she'd told herself was going into the ranch, but that she now suspected had been going primarily into not wanting things she'd decided she wasn't allowed to want. "All right," she said. It was not a declaration. It was something more like a door left slightly open, which was for Mara Ellsworth a significant architectural change. He left at 2 in the afternoon when the road had cleared enough. She stood on her porch and watched him go, and she did not pretend to herself that she was watching for any reason other than the one that was true. January arrived, and with it the particular social season of a frontier winter, not frivolous, not festive in any extravagant way, but marked by the gatherings that practical people used to survive the cabin fever that set in when the cold kept them close to their own fires for too long. There were dinners at the church hall, trading sessions at the feed mill, the occasional gathering at someone's home that started as a business meeting and became something more like human beings, remembering they needed each other. Mara attended these things because she always had. Withdrawing from them would have been noticed and interpreted, and she was not going to give Gideon Vane the satisfaction of driving her indoors. She noticed, attending them, that the social landscape had shifted in ways that were not dramatic, but were real. There were people who greeted her the same as always: Alma Greer, old Hector Pruitt, who ran the livery, the schoolteacher Mrs. Daly, who had always treated Mara with an uncomplicated directness she valued. But there were others who had caught whatever Gideon was spreading through the community's bloodstream, and who now looked at Mara, with a particular species of careful pity, the kind people deployed when they decided someone was unfortunate but didn't want to say so directly. She hated the pity more than she would have hated cruelty. Cruelty at least respected you enough to attack you. Pity just put you in a category and closed the door. Silas came to the January gathering at the feed mill. She had not known he was going to be there. She arrived separately, saw him across the room talking to a couple of the Caldwell hands, and felt the particular small jolt that she now recognized as her own nervous system refusing to behave. He saw her at roughly the same moment. He crossed the room without making it look like he was crossing the room specifically for her, which she understood was a consideration he was making on her behalf. And they stood together near the south wall and talked, and it was completely ordinary and completely not ordinary at the same time. She was aware of people watching them. She kept her face composed. At some point during the evening, she was standing alone near the food table. Silas had been pulled into a conversation with some ranchers about a grazing rights dispute she had no stake in, and Gideon Vane appeared at her elbow with a glass of something and his professional smile. "Miss Ellsworth," he said. "Glad to see you out, mister." "Vane," she said. She picked up a piece of bread she didn't want. "I wanted to speak to you again about the property," he said, keeping his voice conversational, neighborly. "My offer's still open. In fact, I've had the number revised upward. I think you'd find it quite generous." "My answer's the same," she said. "I thought it might be." He looked across the room, and his gaze landed on Silas in a way that was not accidental. "Rourke seems like a good man, steady, the kind who thinks about his future." Mara said nothing. "A man thinking about his future needs to consider all the aspects of it," Gideon continued pleasantly. "Children, legacy, someone to carry things forward. It's not a criticism, it's just the practical reality of life out here. A man who works this hard deserves to know what he's working toward." Mara turned and looked at Gideon Vane directly. He met her gaze without flinching, because men like Gideon Vane did not flinch. They simply recalculated. "You're going to say whatever you're going to say," she said quietly. "I can't stop you, but you should know that I see exactly what you're doing, and I think you're a small man doing a small thing, and I think somewhere underneath all of that money and all of that strategy, you know it too." His smile didn't waver, but something in his eyes adjusted a tiny shift, barely visible, the kind of tell that only showed up when something had actually landed. "Good evening, Miss Ellsworth," he said, and moved away. Mara finished her piece of bread. Her hands were perfectly steady. She was quite proud of her hands. Silas was at her elbow 10 minutes later. He had read the room, she wasn't sure how, but he had. "You all right?" he said quietly. "Fine," she said. "And then he's going to cause trouble, I know." "Real trouble." Public, she looked at him. "Silas, if he says what he's planning to say in front of the wrong people, it's going to make things difficult for you. You told me last night that you were tired of making decisions about my life without asking me," he said. He said it without accusation, just direct. So let me be direct back. I know what he's planning. I've heard things, and I'm still standing here. Mara looked at him for a long moment. "You're going to make everything very complicated," she said, which was exactly what she'd said the night before, and they both knew it. "Probably," he said, which was exactly what he'd said then too, and something in her chest did that thing again, that specific movement that she had stopped trying to prevent. February was brutal, cold that didn't lift, storms that came in sequence as though they'd organized themselves into a schedule. Mara lost a section of the barn roof in a wind event that moved through so fast she barely had warning, and the repairs took 3 days of working in conditions that left her hands cracked and her shoulders burning in a way that woke her up at night. Silas helped when he could get away from Caldwell, and there was a particular afternoon when they were up on the barn roof together in wind that was not quite dangerous, but was definitely unpleasant. And she had looked over at him, both of them flat against the roof boards to avoid being lifted off by a gust, and started to laugh. Not politely, actually laugh, the helpless kind. He looked at her like she'd surprised him. And then he started too, and they were both lying on a barn roof in February, laughing at a situation that was genuinely miserable. And Mara thought, I cannot remember the last time I laughed like this. She could not remember it, and she had tried. They finished the roof. It held. March came in with the particular cruelty of late winter in Montana, warm enough to tease and then cold enough to punish, cycles of hope and betrayal that she'd long since stopped taking personally. But something was different in March, a gathering pressure in the community that she felt the way she felt weather changing, not through a single sign, but through an accumulation of small ones. Gideon was building toward something. She could feel it. She heard from Alma that there were outside investors coming through men from back east who had the capital to make the railroads spur a reality rather than a speculation. She heard that Gideon had been entertaining them lavishly, showing them the corridor, making the case for why the land acquisition was practically complete. Except for hers, she heard from more than one person that he had told these investors her land would be available. As though it were already settled, she sent him a letter. 1 page, 3 sentences. Her land was not available, had never been available, would not be available, and any representation to the contrary was a falsehood she would dispute in front of whatever authority was necessary. She signed it with her full name. He did not respond. What he did instead was announce a winter market. Red Willow Crossing held these periodically, not a formal event, but a gathering of vendors and ranchers and townspeople that served as much social function as commercial one. Gideon offered the use of his warehouse space, which was the largest covered space in the settlement, and the offer was accepted, as Gideon's offers generally were, because refusing them came with costs that most people preferred to avoid. The market was set for the 3rd Saturday of March. Mara almost didn't go. She stood in her kitchen the morning of it and had an honest conversation with herself about whether attending was worth the energy it would cost. She knew Gideon would be there. She knew he had been maneuvering towards some public moment, and public moments happen most efficiently at public events. But she also knew that not going would be understood as retreat. And she was not, had never been, someone who retreated. She put on her good coat and she went. The market was well attended. The warehouse was warm and full of people, ranchers and their families, merchants with their winter stock, women trading preserves and cloth, men discussing spring planting and livestock prices. There was noise and movement, and the particular density of a community that had been indoors for months and was ready to exist alongside each other again. Mara made her way through it with the composed efficiency she brought to town, buying what she needed, exchanging words with the people who offered them. She saw Silas across the room talking to Hector Pruitt. He caught her eye and nodded. She nodded back. They had established, without discussing it, that they would not perform either their connection or the absence of it. They would simply exist in the same space and let that be whatever it was. She was examining a bolt of oilcloth when she heard Gideon's voice change register. Not louder exactly, but projected the voice of someone who had decided the audience was large enough and had begun. Rourke. His voice carried across the warehouse with practiced ease. There he is. Come here, man. I want to ask you something. Mara went still. She did not turn around immediately. She listened. She heard the quality of the room shift the way a room shifted when something was about to happen, conversations dropping to lower registers, attention reorienting. What's this I'm hearing about you and the Ellsworth woman? Gideon said, still pleasantly, still with the smile you could hear even when you couldn't see it. You got serious intentions there, Rourke. The merchant beside Mara had stopped talking. The room was doing what rooms did, which was listen. Silas's voice, when it came, was even. That's between me and Mara Ellsworth. Sure, Gideon said. Just you're a practical man. You work hard. A man working that hard, he thinks about his future, his family, what he's building and who he's building it with. A pause. You ever think about the fact that a cowboy needs an heir? That choosing wrong, choosing a woman who can't give you, that means dying with everything you built going into the dirt with you? The warehouse was quiet enough now that you could hear the wind outside. Mara put down the bolt of oilcloth. She turned around. She could see Gideon. From where she stood, he was positioned near the center of the space, a natural focal point, his investors visible at the edge of the crowd. She could see Silas, maybe 10 feet from Gideon, with an expression she had never seen on his face before, not anger, not embarrassment, but something colder and more considered. And she could feel, without looking, the 50 pairs of eyes that had just moved from Gideon to Silas and were now moving toward her. She started walking, not quickly, not dramatically. She walked the way she walked everywhere, with the particular unhurried purpose of a woman who had never needed to perform her own confidence because she'd built it the hard way and it was therefore entirely real. The crowd parted in that unconscious way crowds did when someone moved through them with sufficient certainty. She came to stand beside Silas, not behind him, beside him. She looked at Gideon Vane, and he looked at her, and his smile held, but she watched his eyes make the small recalculation they'd made at the January gathering, and she felt the satisfaction of knowing she had surprised him again. "Mr. Vane," she said, same quiet voice she used for everything. "If you have something to say about me, say it to me." The warehouse held its breath. Gideon spread his hands in a gesture of reasonableness. "I'm just looking out for a good man, Miss Ellsworth. Making sure people have all the information they need." "Then I'll give them information," she said. She looked at the room ranchers, merchants, women with their children, men who had known her for years. She did not raise her voice. She didn't need to. The room was already silent. 7 years ago, I was sick. The doctor who treated me told my mother there was a chance the fever had damaged things that I might not be able to have children. That was his assessment. It was not a certainty. It was not a promise. But I accepted it as true because I didn't know anything different. She could hear her own heartbeat. She kept her voice level. "Mr. Vane has decided that information is a useful tool for convincing people that I'm a lesser choice. For convincing Silas Rourke specifically that choosing me is a mistake. He's been doing this since December because I won't sell him my land, and this," she looked at Gideon directly, "is what he does when people don't give him what he wants." Gideon's smile was at the very edge of its ability to hold. "A cowboy needs an heir," he said, keeping his voice pleasant. "That's not cruelty. That's truth. A cowboy needs whatever he decides he needs," Silas said. And the room shifted again. Mara looked at Silas. He was looking at Gideon, and his expression was the one she hadn't seen before the cold, considered one, and when he spoke, his voice was quiet, but it carried to every corner of that warehouse. "I came back to her ranch the first time, because her horse needed water," he said. "I came back the second time because she'd left an apron on a fence post. I came back the third time because her gate needed fixing. And I kept coming back because being in her presence is the most honest I've felt in years." He paused. "I know what the doctor told her," she told me herself. "And I'll tell you and everyone else in this building, it doesn't change a single thing about what I've decided." The room was completely still. Gideon opened his mouth. "I'm not finished," Silas said, and something in his voice made Gideon close it again. Silas reached into the pocket of his coat. He brought out something that took Mara a moment to identify: a band, leather, hand-braided with the careful, even work of someone who had spent a lot of time and attention on a small thing. He held it in his open palm. Mara stared at it. "I made this in January," he said. He was not looking at the crowd anymore. He was looking at her. Only at her. "I wasn't sure when it would be the right time to do this. I'm not sure now is the right time, but I'm done waiting for a right time." He held it out to her. "Mara Ellsworth," he said, "I'm asking you to marry me. Not because of what you can give me or what you can't. Because you're the most honest person I've ever sat across a kitchen table from, and because even when you were trying your hardest to push me away, you couldn't make me believe it was what you actually wanted." The warehouse was so quiet that Mara could hear the breathing of the people around her. She looked at the leather band in his palm. She looked at his face. She looked at 7 years of a life she'd built around the premise of not wanting things she'd decided were unavailable, and she felt the foundational assumption of all of it, the diagnosis, the withdrawal, the careful smallness she'd maintained, beginning to come apart at its seams. She was going to say yes. She could feel it rising in her, the answer she hadn't known she'd made until this moment. And then a voice came from the back of the warehouse. If I may, it was not a loud voice, but it was precise and carrying, the voice of someone accustomed to making themselves heard in spaces larger than this one. Mara looked. Most of the room looked. The man who stepped forward was a stranger middle-aged, with a serious face and a physician's bag that was as unmistakable as a uniform. He had apparently been at the back of the market for some time. He looked at the room with the measured discomfort of a man who had arrived in the middle of a situation he had not anticipated. "My name is Dr. Elias Fenwick," he said. "I'm a physician. I've been traveling through this part of Montana for the past month on a circuit." He was holding a leather folder, documents visible inside it. "I came to Red Willow Crossing because I was looking for the records of a doctor. Harold Poole, who practiced in this county approximately 7 years ago. Dr. Poole passed away last spring, and his records have been in something of a chaotic state since. I've been working to locate patients from that period whose diagnoses may have been incomplete." The room was still watching him, but Mara felt the attention shift, felt it, the way air pressure changed before weather. "I believe Miss Ellsworth may be one of those patients, Doctor," Fenwick said. He looked at her directly with a professional gravity that was also, underneath it, genuinely apologetic. "The records I've recovered suggest that Dr. Poole's assessment of your condition made during and immediately after a severe febrile illness was based on an examination that was, by his own later notation, inconclusive. He indicated in a subsequent note that a proper follow-up examination would be necessary to confirm his initial finding." He paused. "There is no record that follow-up examination ever occurred." The warehouse breathed. "What I'm saying," Dr. Fenwick continued, carefully, "is that the diagnosis you received, or the diagnosis you understood yourself to have received, was never medically confirmed. The possibility that the fever caused lasting damage was a concern, not a certainty. And without the follow-up examination, it remains," he chose the word, "precisely unresolved." Mara stood in the center of the warehouse with 50 people around her and the leather folder in a stranger's hands, and Silas Rourke's hand still extended toward her with the braided leather band in his palm. She felt the information land. She felt it move through her. And then she did something she hadn't expected to do. She looked at Silas's hand, not at the folder, not at Doctor Fenwick. At Silas's hand, still extended, still patient, still waiting, the same hand that had been at her elbow when she slipped off the timber, the same hand that had carried an apron down a road to return it for no reason except that it was hers. He hadn't moved. He hadn't looked at the folder. He wasn't looking at the folder now. He was looking at her, only at her, with the expression she had come to understand was not patience so much as certainty, the look of a man who had already made his decision so completely that additional information had no material effect on it. She understood something in that moment, fully and completely, with the specific clarity that came rarely and could not be manufactured. He had asked her before anyone offered the possibility of anything different. His hand had not wavered. The tears came without warning, not dramatic, not the weeping of someone undone, but the involuntary kind, the kind that arrived when something you had protected for a very long time was suddenly, without asking permission, allowed to put down its weight. She reached out and took the leather band from his palm. The warehouse exhaled. "Yes," she said. Her voice was steady, which surprised her. "Yes, Silas, I will." The sound that moved through the crowd was not applause. It was something more involuntary than that. A collective release of the particular tension that had been building, since Gideon opened his mouth and was now resolved in a way he had not planned for and could not reframe. Silas took the band from her hand and slid it onto her wrist. His hands were not entirely steady either. She noticed that, and it meant more to her than steadiness would have. Gideon Vane stood at the edge of it and said nothing. For once he had nothing arranged. His investors were visible at the back of the crowd, watching. His calculation that public humiliation would break down Mara's resistance, would send Silas retreating, would leave her isolated, and the land accessible had run the opposite direction entirely, and the evidence of its failure was standing in front of him in a warehouse full of witnesses. He left shortly after, quietly. Mara stood in the middle of the warehouse with Silas beside her and the leather band on her wrist and Doctor Fenwick still holding his folder, with the uncertain look of a man who had expected his news to be the most important thing in the room and had discovered it was not. She turned to him. She wanted to be fair to him because he had come a long way with real information and real intentions. "Thank you," she said. "I'll come see you for the examination." "I want to know." She paused. "But I want you to understand it doesn't change what just happened." He looked at her and at Silas, and he nodded slowly, with the expression of a man who had just witnessed something he hadn't been trained to assess. "I understand," he said. Around them, the warehouse was returning to its self-conversation, starting up again, the noise of movement and commerce resuming, children who had been held still by adult tension releasing back into their natural motion. Alma Greer appeared at Mara's elbow and squeezed her arm without saying anything, which was the most eloquent thing Alma had done in Mara's memory. Old Hector Pruitt shook Silas's hand with both of his, which was how Hector expressed things he couldn't put words to. Mrs. Daly, the school teacher, looked at Mara across the room with an expression of simple, uncomplicated approval, and Mara felt it land somewhere that had been waiting for that particular acknowledgement for longer than she'd realized. She and Silas stood together in it, not performing anything, not managing anything, just standing in a warehouse in Red Willow Crossing in March, with the winter still visible through the high windows, and the sound of a community that had just been forced to see itself clearly doing the complicated work of deciding what to do with that clarity. Silas looked at the leather band on her wrist. She looked at it too. He had braided it himself. She understood not bought, not had made, but built with his own hands in January, when the storms were at their worst and the road between his work and her ranch was practically impassable, and he had apparently spent that time sitting somewhere quiet, making this. "January," she said. "January," he confirmed. She thought about him in January, in whatever corner of the Caldwell bunkhouse or barn, braiding leather with the particular focused attention she recognized from watching him work with horses, making something she didn't know she was going to receive yet. While she had been lying awake in December listening for barn sounds that had nothing to do with the barn, he had been making this. "You were very sure of yourself," she said. "No," he said. "I was sure of you." She looked at him. "There's a difference," he said. Outside, the March wind moved through Red Willow Crossing with its usual disregard for human events. The winter was not over there, would be more cold, more hard days, more of the endless work that frontier life required, regardless of what else was happening in a person's interior. The barn roof that had been repaired in February would need attention again in spring. The gray mare was due for her hooves. The eastern fence line, the one Mara had been mending when Silas first appeared, would need replacement posts before summer. The work did not stop. But Mara Ellsworth stood in that warehouse with her hand close to a man who had chosen her before there was any reason to believe the story would end differently. And she felt the specific weight of a future she had spent 7 years refusing to believe in settling onto her shoulders, like something she had been trained exactly right to carry. It was not light. It was not without complication. The road ahead had every reason to be difficult. She was, she realized, not afraid of it. That was new. That was perhaps the most significant thing that had changed. The examination with Dr. Fenwick happened 4 days after the market, on a Wednesday morning when the sky was the particular flat-out white of late winter that gave no information about whether it intended to snow or simply stay gray forever. Mara rode into town alone. She had not asked Silas to come, and he had not offered, which was exactly right, he understood, without it being said, that this was something she needed to do in her own company, with her own thoughts, without anyone else's reaction to manage alongside her own. It was one of the things she had come to understand about him in the months since that first lame horse at her fence line. He had an instinct for when to be present and when to stay back, and he had never once gotten the two confused. Dr. Fenwick was staying at the boarding house on the east end of town. He had set up a temporary examination room in one of the larger rooms, with the modest equipment a traveling physician carried and the professional tidiness of someone who had learned to create order in whatever space was available. He was a careful man. Mara had decided at the market not warm exactly, but honest in the way that people who dealt daily with difficult truths eventually became honest, without ornament, without false comfort. He examined her thoroughly and asked questions she answered without flinching, because she had passed the point in her life where flinching at honest questions was something she was willing to spend energy on. He was precise and respectful, and did not treat her like a woman who needed protecting from information which she appreciated. When he was finished, he sat across from her with the folder she'd seen at the market and looked at her with the expression of someone choosing their words carefully, not because the words were bad, but because they were important. "Miss Ellsworth," he said, "based on what I've examined today, and based on Dr. Poole's original notes, which suggest the fever resolved without the complications he initially feared, I see no clear medical evidence that your fertility was permanently compromised." He paused. "I cannot make you a guarantee. Medicine doesn't work that way, and I won't pretend otherwise. But the probability that his initial concern was correct appears, on the evidence I have, to be low." Mara sat with that for a moment. 7 years. She had built 7 years of a particular life around a piece of information that had passed through a cabin wall half-heard and had never been confirmed and had never been questioned and had become, through sheer repetition in her own mind, as solid and immovable as a fence post driven into frozen ground. "He never followed up," she said. Not accusatory, just placing it. "No, his records indicate he intended to return the following spring." There's a notation to that effect. Dr. Fenwick's expression held the specific regret of a professional confronting the failures of his profession. He became ill himself that winter. He never made it back to this part of the territory. Mara looked at her hands, folded in her lap. The leather band was on her left wrist, where it had been since Saturday. She had not taken it off, not even to sleep. "What do I do with this?" she said. It wasn't quite a question directed at him. It was more the kind of thing you said out loud when you were thinking and had momentarily forgotten you weren't alone. "That," Dr. Fenwick said, with the ghost of something that was not quite a smile but was adjacent to one, "is entirely outside my area of expertise." She rode home in the flat white light, and she thought. She thought about the 24-year-old woman who had lain in a sickbed listening to a doctor's voice through a thin wall and had assembled something permanent from incomplete pieces. She thought about how reasonable it had seemed, how responsible, even to accept that verdict, to build accordingly, to not allow herself to want things she'd been told she couldn't have. She had not been wrong exactly to do what she'd done. She had been working with what she had, but 7 years was a long time. And the fence posts of a life built on a misunderstanding, she was now discovering, did not simply pull free when you learned the misunderstanding. They had been driven too deep for that. They required different tools, more time, the patient work of loosening what had been compressed. She told Silas that evening. He came by the ranch after his work at Caldwell. He still worked at Caldwell, still kept his own life in its own shape, and she was grateful for that, for the fact that neither of them had allowed the events of the market to dissolve the boundaries of who they were individually. And she told him what doctor. Fenwick had said while they sat at the kitchen table that had now hosted what felt like the entire history of their relationship. He listened. He didn't react with the uncomplicated happiness she might have expected, which was why she trusted his reaction. He looked at her steadily and then said, "How are you feeling about it?" "Strange," she said. "Not, I don't know, not joyful the way you might expect. More like someone moved a wall I'd been living next to so long I'd stopped seeing it as a wall." He nodded. "That makes sense. It doesn't change what you said at the market," she said. "I want to be clear about that. I'm not saying yes to you because of what doctor. Fenwick told me. I know that, he said. I want you to know that I know you know that, she said, which was slightly tangled, and he almost smiled. I know, he said again. She looked at her hands, at the leather band. I'm 31 years old, and I don't know what's going to happen. And I've spent a very long time being certain about things, and now I'm not certain about most of them. That's probably healthier, he said. It doesn't feel healthier, she said. No, he agreed, it wouldn't. They sat with that for a while, and outside the late winter dark settled around the ranch, and the horses made their barn sounds, and the fire worked at the cold, and nothing was resolved or completed, but it was all, somehow, all right. The spring came the way Montana springs always came, not gently, not with the gradual warming of milder climates, but in lurches 2 steps forward and 1 step sideways. Mud and cold, and then a day of genuine warmth that made everything seem possible before the temperature dropped again, and reminded you that the season had its own timeline and was not interested in yours. By April, the worst of it was over. By May, the valley was green in a way that Mara always found slightly startling no matter how many times she'd seen it, as though the world had decided to stop arguing and commit. The wedding was in the 2nd week of May. It was not a large event. Mara had not wanted large, and Silas had not needed it, and they had discussed it for approximately 12 minutes before agreeing that what they both wanted was something that felt like them honest, practical, without performance. They were married in the field behind Mara's barn because it was her land, and she had worked every inch of it, and she wanted the place where she made this particular promise to be connected to that work. Mrs. Daly served as witness. Hector Pruitt came with his wife and stood at the back with his hat in his hands and the expression of a man attending something he found genuinely moving and had no language for. Alma Greer brought food because Alma Greer's primary love language was provision, and this was not a moment for interfering with a person's fundamental nature. There were perhaps 20 people. Some of them were there because they'd always been kind. Some of them were there because the events of the winter market had shifted something in them, and they were, in the quietly human way of people who had behaved badly through passivity, trying to correct toward something better. Mara accepted the attendance of both groups without comment because she had decided that the winter was over, and what happened in it had happened, and now they were in spring, and she intended to inhabit spring fully. The ceremony itself was short. The justice of the peace who performed it was a man named Aldridge, who had been doing this work for 20 years and had learned that the best ceremonies got out of the way of the people having them. He said what needed saying. Silas and Mara said what they'd agreed to say, which was not complicated and was entirely their own. Silas said, I'm not promising you easy. I'm promising you honest, and that I'll show up and that I'll still be there when I should have given up. Mara said, I spent a long time building a life I could manage alone. I'm not giving that up. I'm expanding it, and I'm choosing you to be part of what I'm building, which is the most significant choice I know how to make. Aldridge pronounced them married. Silas kissed her in the May morning field behind the barn she'd rebuilt with her own hands, and it was slightly awkward because they were both practical people who were not accustomed to doing private things in front of audiences. And afterward, Alma cried loudly enough to cover anyone else's response, and Hector shook Silas's hand again with both of his, and Mrs. Daly said to Mara, quietly, good. It was time, which was exactly the right thing, and exactly Mara's feeling about it. They ate. They talked. People began to go home as the afternoon moved on, by ones and twos, until it was just Mara and Silas in the field and the sound of the horses in the barn, and the valley spread out below them in the May light. Well, Silas said. Well, Mara said. They stood there in the field together, and neither of them said anything else for a while, and it was fine. The practical architecture of combining 2 lives took most of the summer. Silas gave up his position at Caldwell not immediately, and not without a plan, because both of them were constitutionally unable to make large changes without thinking them through, and by July he had moved his things to the ranch, which was a project that revealed how little he owned and how carefully he'd maintained what he had. He brought 3 horses of his own, his tack, his tools, and a modest collection of personal items that filled the extra room without crowding it. He was different in the house than she'd expected. Not difficult, the opposite. He was quiet in the way people were quiet when they were genuinely comfortable rather than performing consideration, and he took up his own space without taking up hers. And the mornings, which had always been the hours she'd been most particular about, turned out to be the hours she minded sharing least because he woke early and didn't need conversation before coffee, which was the only true test of compatibility she'd ever believed in. They argued occasionally, not about large things, mostly about small operational ones, how to manage the gray mare's training, whether to expand the north pasture fence this season or next, what to do about a water drainage problem on the eastern edge of the property that they had genuinely different theories about. The arguments were direct and sometimes heated, and always resolved by evidence, which was not the quickest method, but was the most reliable one. She did not always win. Neither did he. This seemed correct to both of them. Gideon Vane's name came up less as the summer went on. He was still county, still operating, but his railroad project had encountered problems that had nothing to do with Mara's land. The investors he'd brought through in March had not, in the end, committed at the level he'd needed, and the spur line remained what it had always been, a speculation. Without the railroad certainty, the land along the corridor was simply land. Still valuable, but not extraordinarily so, and not worth the reputational cost of continuing to pursue someone who had proven, publicly and in front of witnesses, that she was not going to move. He did not approach her again. She did not go looking for a resolution with him. Some things, she had learned, resolved themselves better when you left them alone and focused on the actual work of your own life. By August, the ranch was running better than it had in years. The two of them together were simply more capable than either of them alone, not because she'd been incapable, she hadn't. She'd done everything that needed doing, but because there was a mathematics to two people working that was fundamentally different from one person working twice as hard. She had more time. He had more resources. The horses benefited. The land benefited. The fence line along the eastern pasture, the one she'd been mending when they first met, was in better condition than it had ever been. She still woke early. She still made her rounds before breakfast. These things did not change, but she made them knowing someone was in the house she was returning to, and the knowing of it was different from how she'd imagined it would be when she'd thought about it in the abstract during the 7 years she'd spent not allowing herself to think about it. It was better in some ways. In other ways, it was harder. People were not improved by love in the way. Stories sometimes suggested they were just themselves, with all their edges, trying to build something that accommodated the other person's edges without losing their own shape. It required attention and patience, and the willingness to be wrong, and Mara was better at some of these than others, and so was Silas, and they were not always wrong and right about the same ones, which helped. It was in the late summer August, turning toward September, the first breath of coming autumn in the morning air, that Mara heard about the boy. She heard it from Mrs. Daly, who stopped by on a Saturday morning on her way to something else, and mentioned it the way she mentioned things, directly, without excessive framing. A family named Carver had lived about 8 miles northeast, a young couple with a son. They had both taken sick in July, a fast illness, the kind that showed no mercy for youth or good health. The husband had gone first, then the wife, within a week of each other. Their son James had survived because he had been at a neighbor's farm when the worst of it hit. He was 7 years old. He had no family in the territory. The neighbors who had him were themselves managing a difficult season and had limited capacity to take in another child permanently. Mrs. Daly said this plainly, without editorial, and then said she needed to get on and left. Mara stood in her kitchen after she left and thought about a 7-year-old boy with no parents and nowhere particular to go, and she thought about it with a directness that surprised her, not the circling, careful thinking she'd done about most things for most of her adult life, but something more immediate and clear. She told Silas that evening. He listened to everything she said. When she was finished, he looked at the table for a moment and then at her. "What do you want to do?" he said. "I want to go see him," she said. "I want to, I don't know what I want. I want to see him and understand the situation better." "All right," he said. "You're not going to ask questions about whether this is practical." "It's practical or it isn't," he said. "But first we'd need to see the boy." He looked at her steadily. "Is that what you want to do tomorrow?" "Yes," she said. "Then that's what we'll do tomorrow," he said. They drove the 8 miles northeast on a Sunday morning, which was the same flat August light that made the valley look enormous and calm. The neighbors, a family named Brower, met them at the door with the particular mixture of relief and guilt that people wore when they needed help and were not sure they were allowed to ask for it. They had clearly been doing their best with James, but their best was stretched thin, and it showed. James was sitting at the Browers' kitchen table when Mara and Silas came in. He was smaller than she'd expected. She'd pictured a sturdier child for some reason, but he was slight, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes that were doing the specific work of a child who had learned recently that adults could disappear and was now examining every new adult for signs of whether they were the permanent kind. He looked at Mara. She looked at him. "I'm Mara," she said. "This is Silas. We have a ranch south of here." "I know about the ranch," he said. "Mrs. Brower told me." His voice was careful. "You have horses." "8 of them," she said, "and a gray mare that thinks she's in charge of all the others." Something moved across his face, not a smile yet, but the precursor to one, a kind of reconsideration. "Is she?" he said. "Probably," Mara admitted. "They stayed for 2 hours." James was not, it became clear. A child who warmed up quickly or showed his interior to strangers without reason. He was watchful and contained in a way that Mara recognized as the specific self-management of someone who had recently had to learn to be more careful about what they expected from the world. She did not try to speed up his warming. She sat with him and talked about horses and the ranch and the valley, and she answered his questions honestly, including the ones that were slightly harder to answer honestly, because she could tell he was listening for honesty the way people listened for it when they'd been let down by the absence of it. Silas sat across from the boy for most of it, saying relatively little, which was Silas's way. He let the room develop before he added himself to it. And James, she noticed, kept looking at him the way children looked at adults they were trying to classify. At some point, Silas asked him whether he'd had any experience with horses, and James had said he'd ridden once, and Silas had said that once was a start, and the look James gave him after that was the most unguarded thing he'd shown them. On the drive home, Mara said nothing for a long time. Silas drove and didn't fill the silence. "He's so careful," she said finally. "He's been through a lot," Silas said. "Yes." She watched the road. "I want to bring him home." Silas nodded. He said nothing immediately, which was how she knew he was thinking rather than reacting. "There are things to arrange," he said. "Legal things. We'd need to talk to Aldridge about what the process looks like." "I know, and he'd need to want to come. It can't be something we decide for him." "I know that too," she said. "I wouldn't want it to be." He looked at her briefly, then back at the road. "Then let's find out what the process is." It took 6 weeks. There were conversations with Aldridge. There were county records to locate. There were people to speak to and documents to sign, and at least one morning, when a territorial official rode out to the ranch and looked around with the expression of someone completing a formality they'd already decided the outcome of, which turned out to be correct. The process was thorough in some places and threadbare in others, the way frontier law was generally patches of rigor, surrounded by significant gaps where practical common sense was expected to operate. Through all of it, they visited James. First Mara alone, then Mara and Silas together, and eventually, in the 4th week, when the boy's caution had thawed to the point where he asked them when they were coming back before they'd finished leaving, they took him to the ranch for a full day. He met the horses. He met the gray mare, who regarded him with her typical suspicious appraisal, and then in the manner that had surprised Mara when she'd seen it directed at Silas, dropped her nose to his shoulder and left it there. James stood very still under the gray mare's attention, with both hands at his sides and an expression that was too complicated for a 7-year-old face to fully contain. "She likes you," Mara said. "She can tell the difference," he said, using her own words back at her, and she felt something crack open in her chest in the most specific and wonderful way. He came home with them in September, not as a guest. Not on a trial basis. They had not wanted to bring him into the house with the language of uncertainty attached, because he had had enough uncertainty, and they had decided that if they were going to do this, they would do it fully, and without the kinds of hedge words that communicated to a child that their place was conditional. He came as theirs, in the only way that mattered, which was that everyone in the house had decided it was so. He had nightmares in the first weeks. She had expected something like this not because anyone had warned her, but because she was not naive about what grief looked like in a 7-year-old who had very recently lost everyone he'd expected to be permanent. She got up when she heard him, and sat in the doorway of his room, and talked quietly about unremarkable things until the dream receded and he slept again. She did not make an event of it. She did not offer more comfort than he wanted, because she had learned already that James accepted comfort on his own schedule, and offering it ahead of that schedule made him retreat. Silas, she discovered, had his own approach. He found James tasks. Not chores in the punitive sense, but real work, the kind of work that required attention and produced something visible at the end of it. He taught James how to check a horse's hooves and what to look for in the angle and the hoof wall. He showed him how the fence line along the eastern pasture worked, which posts needed replacement, and how you drove a new one without losing your thumb in the process. He did not talk to James the way adults sometimes talk to children, simplified, slightly elevated, conscious of the gap. He talked to him like a person who was smaller and knew less, and would eventually know more. James responded to this the way he'd responded to most things that were honest, with focused, watchful attention, and then, eventually, with questions. The questions were how you knew where you stood with James. When he started asking questions, it meant he'd decided you were worth asking. By October, he was asking Silas questions every day. By November, he had started calling Mara ma'am in a way that was different from how he'd called her ma'am when they first met, less formal, more habitual, a word that had shifted its own meaning through repetition. The ranch was different with him in it, louder in the mornings, slower in the evenings. There were things to explain that she'd never had to explain to anyone: why the gray mare got her feed last rather than first, why certain gates were left certain ways, why winter preparations began in September rather than October, and what happened if they didn't. She found she didn't mind explaining them. She found, more specifically, that she liked the way James listened when she explained things, with the complete attention of a person who had decided the information was worth having. She had not expected to be good at this. She had not expected to be bad at it either. She had been too careful about not expecting it at all. But she was discovering, practically and daily, that she was not as inexperienced with care as she'd assumed. She had been caring for things her entire adult life: horses, fences, land, small broken creatures that wandered onto her property and needed attention. The scale was different with a child. The stakes were profoundly different. But the instinct was not foreign. Silas was better at some parts of it than she was. She was better at other parts. This seemed like the right arrangement. December came, and with it the first anniversary of the storm that had trapped Silas in her house and started the conversation that had been, in retrospect, the hinge on which everything else had turned. She thought about that night sometimes, the specific quality of it, the storm loud enough to make the walls shake, the two of them at the kitchen table with nowhere to go except toward honesty. She thought about how close she had come to making it impossible for that night to happen. All the small acts of withdrawal, the strategic unavailability, the careful maintenance of a life designed to need no one any of them, pushed a little further, could have been enough. She was grateful, in a way that had nothing to do with sentiment and everything to do with plain recognition, that they hadn't been. James had asked her, one evening in November, why the leather band on her wrist never came off. He had been watching her for a while before asking, which was his pattern he observed before he inquired. She had looked at the band and thought about how to explain it to a 7-year-old honestly. Silas made it, she said, and he gave it to me in front of a lot of people at a time when it mattered very much that he did. James considered this. Why did it matter? Because someone was trying to make me feel like I wasn't worth choosing, she said. And Silas chose me anyway, in front of everyone. James was quiet for a moment. Did it work? What the bad man was trying to do? No, she said. Because Silas stopped him? She thought about it. Silas helped, but I think I stopped him first by not leaving. She paused. You can't humiliate someone who doesn't run. James looked at the leather band again. I'm not going to run either, he said. It was said with the absolute seriousness of a child who had thought about it and made a decision. She looked at him for a moment. Good, she said. He went back to his supper. She looked across the table at Silas, who had heard all of this, and was looking at his plate with the expression of a man who was feeling something he wasn't going to put into words at the dinner table. And she understood the expression completely because she was having the same one. The winter settled around the ranch. The preparations were the same as always: fuel, food stores, animals brought close, fence lines checked. The work was the same, but the house that contained the work was different, and the difference was not reducible to a single thing. It was the weight of James's boots by the door and the particular rhythm of 3 people's mornings and the gray mare's habit of looking for James specifically when she heard sounds from the house. It was Silas's coffee cup always in the same place, and his tools hung with a precision that she had initially found faintly irritating and had gradually come to find oddly reassuring. It was all the small accumulated evidence of a life that had expanded beyond what she'd allowed herself to plan for. She had spent 7 years building something sturdy enough to hold her alone. What she hadn't known, building it, was that she'd been building something sturdy enough to hold more. The second winter with Silas in the house was different from the first, in ways that were small but cumulative, the way most real differences were. The first winter, the one that had contained the storm and the kitchen table conversation and everything that followed, had been a winter of becoming, of 2 people learning each other's edges and deciding what to do with them. It had been uncomfortable in the specific way that genuine change was always uncomfortable, the way a healing thing ached before it didn't. This winter had a different quality. It had James in it, for one thing. It had the gray mare's habit of looking toward the house at breakfast time because James had started bringing her a piece of carrot every morning before school, and she had reorganized her internal schedule accordingly, with the absolute conviction of a horse who had decided a routine was now a right. It had the sound of 3 people moving through the same space, not always harmoniously, not without friction, but with the specific organic quality of people who had stopped being careful around each other and had started simply being. Mara noticed the change in herself most clearly in December, about 14 months after the market. When she caught herself planning the following summer's expansion of the South Pasture with a specificity and confidence that required believing in a future she was actually going to inhabit. Not a future she was managing toward or protecting against, but one she was building for. The distinction was subtle and total. She was also, by December, tired in a way she couldn't fully account for. Not the tired of overwork she knew that tired, had lived inside it for years, and this was different. This was something more interior, a heaviness that sat behind her eyes in the mornings and didn't clear until midday, and a persistent low-grade nausea that came and went without obvious cause. She attributed it to the season change at first, to the accumulated demands of fall preparation and Jamie's adjustment, and the ongoing work of the ranch. She was not someone who cataloged her own physical symptoms. With much attention, her body was a working instrument, and she maintained it the way she maintained the barn, practically, and without excessive monitoring. But by January it had not resolved, and she was a practical woman, and practical women eventually looked at evidence. She lay in the dark one night, listening to Silas's even breathing beside her, and the wind outside performing its usual commentary on the state of things, and she counted backward. Then she counted forward. Then she lay very still and let the number sit in her head. She thought about Dr. Fenwick, who had said, "The probability appears to be low." She thought about what low meant in medicine, which was not the same as impossible, which was not the same as certain, which was not the same as any single clear thing. She thought about a 24-year-old woman hearing words through a cabin wall and building 7 years of her life around the weight of them. She did not wake Silas. She lay in the dark and breathed and let the possibility exist in her head without forcing it into a shape yet. This was something she was learning, that not everything needed to be handled immediately, that some things needed to be simply held for a while before they were ready to be dealt with. It was not her strongest skill. She was better at action than at waiting. But she was getting better. In the morning, she made coffee and breakfast and sent James out to check on the gray mare. And when Silas came in from the early feeding, she said, without preamble, "I want to go see Doctor." Fenwick, he looked at her. He had the coffee cup halfway to his mouth, and he stopped with it there. When, he said, soon, she said, he looked at her face. He was good at reading her face, better than she was comfortable with. Honestly, though she'd stopped pretending she didn't appreciate it. "All right," he said. He sat down at the kitchen table, the one that had heard everything. "Are you worried?" "I don't know what I am yet," she said. "I want to know something before I decide what to be." He nodded. He drank his coffee. He did not ask her more questions, which was exactly right, and she thought not for the first time and not for the last that this specific quality in him, this ability to wait without filling the space with his own anxiety, was something she had not known she needed in another person until she had it. Dr. Fenwick was still in the territory. He had extended his circuit through the winter, covering the settlements that most needed a physician's presence in the hardest months, and Mara found him at the boarding house in town on a Tuesday in late January, sitting over paperwork with the expression of a man who had chosen a life that gave him very little rest and had made his peace with that. He remembered her. He set his paperwork aside with the particular attention of a physician greeting a returning patient and showed her into the examination room he'd maintained in the same larger room upstairs. She told him her symptoms. He asked his questions. He was thorough, and he did not rush, and he did not allow his expression to tell her anything before he was ready to tell her with words which she appreciated. The examination was not long. When it was done, he sat across from her with the specific expression she had seen on him once, before careful, precise, choosing words for their accuracy rather than their comfort, and he said, "Mrs. Rourke, based on what I'm seeing today, I believe you are approximately 8 to 10 weeks pregnant." The room was very quiet. Mara sat with the words. She had been prepared for this possibility. She had assembled herself in the direction of it during the sleepless hour in January, during the 3 days between that night and this examination, during the ride into town this morning. She had not allowed herself to go fully toward it, had not let herself want it out loud, in case the wanting made the absence of it worse, but she had been prepared. And yet the words, said plainly in the flat winter light of a boarding house examination room, landed completely differently than any preparation had suggested they would. "Are you certain?" she said. Her voice was steady. She was faintly amazed at her voice. "As certain as I can be at this stage," he said. "Early examinations have limits, but the signs are clear and consistent." He paused. "I would want to see you again in 4 weeks to confirm further." "Yes," she said. "All right." She rode home. She did not go quickly. She let the horse set its own pace along the road, through the valley where the snow was packed and rutted from winter use, past the fence line where she had first seen a man with a lame gelding stop and take his horse's weight with the automatic attention of someone who knew animals and took their pain seriously. She rode past all of it in the January cold, and she let the information exist in her at whatever pace it needed to move. By the time she reached her own gate, the gate Silas had fixed 18 minutes, the first time he came to her property, she had arrived at something. Not joy exactly. Something larger and more complicated than joy. something that had grief inside it as well as happiness, because you could not spend 7 years mourning a future and then discover that future was available without feeling the weight of those years alongside the relief of this one. The 24-year-old woman who had listened through a cabin wall deserved to be part of this moment too, deserved to be acknowledged rather than left behind. She got down from the horse and stood at her own gate for a moment. Then she went inside. Silas was at the kitchen table. He had been working on something harness repair, by the look of it, and he set it down when she came in. He looked at her face, and she watched him read it the way he always read her, carefully and without rushing. She took off her coat. She sat down at the table, Doctor. Fenwick says I'm pregnant, she said. The sound Silas made was not words. It was something prior to words, something that came from a place in him that words hadn't reached yet. He put both hands flat on the table, the way her mother had put her hands flat on the table the day the doctor left after the fever, the gesture of someone who needed to feel something solid. He looked at her. She looked at him. Are you all right? He said. Because that was Silas. First question was always about her, not about the information itself. I think so, she said. I don't know what I am. I've been trying to figure that out on the ride home. That's fair, he said. Take your time. I keep thinking about. She stopped. Started again. I spent so long deciding that this wasn't going to be part of my life. And now it is. And I'm happy about it. I want to be clear about that, I am. But I'm also, she pressed her lips together. 7 years is a long time to believe something. It is, he said. And I don't want to, I need you to understand that this doesn't change what we already have. Jamie is, her voice tightened slightly, which surprised her. She hadn't expected to feel that particular protectiveness in this moment. Jamie is ours. That is not a lesser thing because of this. Mara, his voice was quiet and completely certain. I know that. I need to say it out loud. Then say it as many times as you need to, he said. She looked at him across the kitchen table that had held every true thing she'd said in the past year and a half. We're going to have a baby, she said, out loud in full for the first time. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. They sat like that for a while without saying anything, and the fire worked at the cold, and outside the January wind moved across the valley with its usual indifference to human events. And neither of them tried to make it into something it wasn't. They just let it be what it was, which was large and real and theirs. James came in from the barn 20 minutes later with cold cheeks and hay in his hair and the gray mare's smell on his coat, and he stopped in the doorway and looked at both of them at the table with the particular radar of a child who had learned to read rooms before he read books. What happened, he said. Flat, wary old habit. Mara looked at him. She had thought about this on the ride home too, how to tell him, when to tell him, in what language. She had decided in the end that the only language that had ever worked with James was the direct one. Something is going to change, she said, in the summer. We're going to have a baby. James stood in the doorway. His coat was still on. His expression was doing several things at once, in the way children's expressions sometimes did when they hadn't yet learned to simplify their responses for adult comfort. A baby, he said. Yes, a real one. Yes, Jamie. He was quiet for a moment. Where's it going to sleep? Silas made a sound that was almost a laugh. We'll figure that out, Mara said. James appeared to be running calculations. Is it going to need a lot of attention? In the beginning, yes, she said. Is it going to touch my things? Probably not for a while. They're very small at the start. He considered this. His expression had moved from its initial wariness towards something that was beginning to look cautiously like interest. Will it be able to ride? Eventually, Silas said. Takes a few years. I could teach it, James said. The word it was already shifting towards something else in his mouth. She could hear it, the first movement toward a person, toward a role he was beginning to place himself in relation to. The gray mare likes me. I could teach it about horses. That would be very helpful, Mara said. He looked at both of them once more, making sure nothing about their expressions contradicted anything he'd been told, which was a habit she understood and did not rush him out of. Then he took off his coat and hung it on the hook and went about the business of the afternoon, which was his way he processed things by returning to the ordinary, by letting the large things settle while the hands did something small. She understood him, she thought, because she was not entirely different. The pregnancy was not easy. She had not expected easy. She was 32 years old and had spent a decade doing physical work that was not gentle, and her body had opinions about carrying a child that expressed regularly and without diplomacy. The nausea lasted longer than Dr. Fenwick suggested it typically did. Her back gave her trouble in the 4th month that required her to change how she worked, which she managed with poor grace and Silas's deliberate patience. She was short-tempered on the days when the tiredness sat on her like a stone, and the work still needed doing regardless, and she said things she did not mean, and then said so directly, because she was not someone who could apologize indirectly and had decided not to start. Silas did not handle it perfectly. He overrode her judgment about physical tasks twice in the 5th month, which led to arguments that were genuine rather than petty and required real resolution rather than simple apology. He was also, she discovered, anxious, in a way he was not always able to manage as cleanly as his exterior suggested. She found him twice at the kitchen table in the early morning before she was supposed to be awake, sitting in the lamplight with his coffee and his own thoughts, and both times he looked up at her with an expression she recognized as the specific face of a person carrying worry they hadn't found the right container for. "Talk to me," she said the second time. "I don't want to put it on you," he said. "We're married," she said. "It's already on me. The question is whether we carry it together or separately." He looked at the table, then at her. "What if something goes wrong?" he said. "What if the pregnancy? What if she?" Mara said. He looked slightly caught. "I think it's a girl," he said, with the sheepishness of a practical man who had been harboring an impractical conviction. "I don't have a reason for it." Mara sat down at the table. At 2 a.m. in January, in the kitchen that had held so much of their life. "Something might go wrong," she said. "That's true. And if it does, we'll be here, and we'll manage it, because that's what we do." She looked at him. "But something might not go wrong too, and I've spent a long time working against possibilities that didn't happen. I'm trying to stop doing that." He reached across and took her hand. He had done this at this table before, the night she told him the pregnancy news, and it meant the same thing both times, a simple placement of himself in her vicinity, a physical statement that required no translation. Mara said again, tasting the word. "I could be wrong," he said. "You could," she agreed. "We'll see." He was not wrong. Their daughter arrived in the last week of June, which was the same season Mara had arrived in the world, which she noted without assigning significance to, because she was not a woman who stacked coincidences into omens. She arrived with the specific lack of consideration for anyone's schedule that newborns operated on, in the early morning hours when the light was just beginning, with Dr. Fenwick present and Alma Greer standing by as midwife's support in a capacity she had apparently been quietly preparing for since March, and had simply failed to mention until she showed up ready. The birth was hard. Mara had been told it would likely be hard, and it was, and she got through it the way she got through everything hard by keeping her attention on what was directly in front of her and not permitting herself to think too far ahead. Silas stayed through all of it in a way she hadn't anticipated. She had assumed he would wait, the way men generally waited, and he had instead made clear, quietly and without negotiation, that he was not going anywhere. He held her hand during the worst of it and said almost nothing, and that was exactly what she needed, which she did not have the breath to tell him at the time and told him afterward in full. When it was over and Dr. Fenwick placed the child in her arms, Mara looked down at her daughter and felt the specific weight of a moment that had no comparison in her previous experience. She had not known what she was going to feel. She had been genuinely uncertain right up to this moment because she had heard from women what it was supposed to be like, and had always suspected her own version might be different, more complicated, less immediate. The response of someone who had arrived at this through a longer and more contested route. She had prepared herself for needing time. She did not need time. She looked at this small, inconvenient, thoroughly present person in her arms and felt something lock into place that she hadn't known was unlatched. Silas was beside her. She didn't look at him immediately. She couldn't look away from the baby yet, but she felt him there. "She's here," he said, quietly, to her, to the room, to no one specifically. "She's here," Mara said. Across the room, James was standing in the doorway. They had not been sure whether to have him in the house for this, and he had solved the problem by simply being in the house when it happened, which was a solution of the kind she was learning to expect from him. He was standing with both hands in his pockets, and his hair still messy from sleep, and an expression of such concentrated, undefended feeling that Mara had to look away from him, because it was too much, that face, in this moment. "Jamie," Silas said, "come see your sister." The word sister landed in the room with the specific weight of a word being used for the first time, in a context where it belonged completely. James crossed the room and looked down at the baby in Mara's arms with the focused attention he gave to things that mattered. "She's very small," he said. "She'll get bigger," Mara said. "She's red, that improves too." He looked for a long moment. Then he put one careful finger against the baby's hand, and her hand closed around it with the unconscious grip of newborns who did not yet know what they were holding. And James looked at that closed grip with an expression that had nothing behind it anymore. No wariness, no calculation, nothing held back. "Hi," he said quietly to her, just that. Mara watched her son look at her daughter and felt the full meaning of the word family, for possibly the first time not as a shape she'd been told she would have, or a shape she'd decided to live without, but as the specific, imperfect, astonishing collection of people standing in this room at this particular hour of this June morning. She named her Clara, not for anyone in particular, just because it fit. The summer that followed was the hardest and the best she could remember, which was a combination that seemed contradictory until you were living it and understood that the difficulty and the goodness were not separate things, but the same thing expressed in different registers. Clara was a demanding infant with strong opinions about sleep schedules, which were primarily that she did not have them. Mara was more tired than she had ever been doing ranch work, which she had not believed was possible, and she had been wrong. There were nights when she sat up feeding Clara in the dark and felt the particular hollow exhaustion of someone who was doing something genuinely hard and understood, simultaneously, that she would not give up a single moment of it. And those two facts coexisted without resolving into each other. Silas took the night feedings when she let him. She didn't always let him. There was a stubbornness in her about managing her own portion of difficulty, a habit built over long years of solitary self-sufficiency that did not dissolve simply because it was no longer necessary. But she was working on it. He did not make her feel guilty for the nights she didn't hand Clara over, and he did not let her refuse help so completely that she ran herself into the ground. They found a middle, which was not always the same place and required continuous negotiation, but which existed. James was unexpectedly good with Clara. Not in a performed way, not in the way children sometimes performed older sibling, responsibility for adult approval, but genuinely, and with the specific attentiveness he brought to things he'd decided were his to care for. He learned the sounds she made before Mara had fully cataloged them. He understood before anyone told him which types of crying meant what. He had a particular way of holding her slightly awkward, very deliberate, that Clara responded to with the acceptance of someone who recognized sincerity. One afternoon in August, Mara came in from the barn to find James sitting on the porch with Clara asleep against his chest, both of them completely still in the late afternoon heat. James reading with his free hand a book Silas had given him about horse bloodlines. He looked up when Mara appeared and put his finger to his lips, the universal signal. Understood across all cultures and ages, and she stopped on the steps and stood there in the August light, looking at her son and her daughter and feeling something that was too quiet for the word joy and too large for any other word she had. She went back to the barn without going in. Some moments needed to keep their own shape. Gideon Vane's railroad project finally failed completely in September of that year. The news came through the way most county news came through Alma, who had it from her husband at the mill, who had it from the county office. The Eastern investors had withdrawn. The capital had not materialized at the levels required. The spur line would not be built, at least not along that corridor, at least not for the foreseeable future. The land Gideon had bought, the picket place, the Harmon acreage, the several other parcels he'd accumulated at significant expense, was now simply land. Valuable for ranching, as all land was in the valley, but not the extraordinary windfall he had leveraged his strategy to produce. He had spent more acquiring those properties than their current market value would recover, and the county knew it. And the particular subtle currency of a man's standing, which Gideon had always managed with a jeweler's precision, had been devalued by failure in a way that money alone could not repair. Mara heard the news on a Wednesday afternoon and felt almost nothing about it. That surprised her. She had spent months the previous year carrying the weight of Gideon Vane's, maneuvering the anger of it, the cost of it, the days when his campaign against her reputation had made simply walking into town feel like a thing requiring preparation. She had believed when it was happening that she would feel something significant when it was over. What she felt was something close to nothing, a mild, distant satisfaction, the way you felt when a headache that had lasted all day finally lifted real relief, but nothing like the proportional opposite of the pain, because you had moved on with your life while the headache was still happening, and the lifting of it was simply the confirmation of something that had already mostly resolved. She told Silas that evening, matter-of-factly, over supper. The railroad failed, she said. His investors pulled out. Silas nodded. He was cutting a piece of bread for James, who had asked for more and had been told to wait until he'd finished what was on his plate, which was an ongoing negotiation. "How do you feel about it?" "Less than I expected," she said. He considered that. "That's probably right," he said. "I thought I'd feel more. The thing you were fighting wasn't him," Silas said. He handed James the bread with the look of a man who had decided the plate was close enough to finished. "You were fighting what he was trying to take from you. You kept that. The fight's been over for a while." She looked at him. "You're occasionally very wise," she said. Occasionally, he agreed without particular modesty. James looked between them with the expression of someone who had noted the dynamic and filed it. What happened to Gideon Vane after that was nothing dramatic. He did not leave the county. He did not reform himself into a better man. He contracted. The way men contracted when the strategy they'd built their identity around failed became smaller, quieter, less present in the rooms where he'd previously positioned himself. He still had money. He still had property. He was simply no longer someone the county organized itself around, which was precisely the loss that would cost a man like him the most, and precisely the one Mara had not needed to engineer. She had simply stayed. She had not sold her land, had not been humiliated out of it, had not been maneuvered into the isolated position he'd designed for her. And her refusal to move had been, in the end, the most complete response available to her. The years that followed moved in the way. Good years moved not without difficulty, not without the regular friction and failure and repair that any real life produced, but with a forward momentum that felt earned rather than granted. Clara grew from the demanding infant into a demanding toddler, and then into a child who had strong opinions about everything, and was, Mara had to admit, more like her than was always convenient. She had Mara's stubbornness and Silas's patience for detail, and something entirely her own, a boldness that seemed to have arrived fully formed, that sent her toward rather than away from things that made more cautious children hesitate. She walked at 10 months and ran at 11, and there was no slowing her down after that. James grew differently, steadily, with the accumulating confidence of someone building something rather than discovering it. He was 12 when Clara turned 4, and the 4 years between them produced a dynamic that was sometimes maddening and always genuine. He was not a gentle older brother in the conventional sense, but he was a real one, which Mara suspected was better. He argued with Clara, which she respected, and he defended her in front of other children, which Clara accepted as her due without understanding yet what it cost him to do. He had become, by his 12th year, someone that Mara occasionally caught Silas watching with an expression she recognized as the specific pride of a person observing evidence that the right seeds had been planted in the right ground. James was still careful, still watchful those qualities had not dissolved, and she hoped they wouldn't, because they were part of what made him James, but he wore them differently now. They were tools he'd learned to use rather than armor he'd learned to need. One spring afternoon, when Claire was 4 and James was 12, and the valley was at that particular peak of green that still, every year, startled her slightly, Mara was in the south pasture checking the fence line, the same eastern fence line, extended and expanded over the years, that she had been mending when a man first appeared at her gate with a lame horse and no particular expectation of anything. She heard Silas before she saw him. The sound of his work, the specific rhythm of a man who was good at what he did and had stopped performing it, for anyone's benefit, came from 20 yards away, where a section of fencing needed post replacement. She had been doing her part of the fence line, he had been doing his, and they would meet somewhere in the middle, which was more or less how they operated everything. She paused where she was and watched him work for a moment without him knowing she was watching. He was 40 now, which she noted with the particular awareness of someone taking inventory. Not old, not what she would have called old before she understood what old actually required. There was gray at his temples that hadn't been there when he'd appeared at her fence with a lame horse, and his movements had the specific economy of someone who had figured out exactly how much effort anything required and applied that, and no more. He was talking to himself, or to the fence post, low and continuous, the same tone she'd heard him use in the barn the morning after the storm when he'd thought no one was listening. She stood in the late afternoon light and felt the full inventory of the years between that first lame horse and this fence post. The storm, the kitchen table, the market, the leather band she still wore on her wrist, worn now with the particular soft quality that things acquired when they'd been part of a person long enough. Dr. Fenwick's careful face in the boarding house examination room, first the information that reorganized 7 years of belief, then the information that reorganized everything again, differently. James in the doorway with hay in his hair, Clara's grip on his finger on the morning she arrived. The 24-year-old woman who had heard words through a cabin wall. Mara had thought about her many times over the years, the younger version of herself who had made her decision so quietly and so completely. She had stopped being angry at that version of herself somewhere in the 2nd year of her marriage. The younger Mara had been working with what she had. She had done what she could see to do in the direction of honesty and practicality. She had not been wrong to be careful. She had just been wrong about what she was being careful of. She had been protecting herself from loss that had already happened when the actual losses she had not yet imagined were the 7 years themselves, 7 years of a future she had refused to believe in, refused to want, refused to let in. Those were what she'd lost, not the children she might not have had. The years she'd spent deciding not to want them. That was the thing she had come to slowly, over time, without a single moment of clarity, but through an accumulation of smaller ones. The choice to stop wanting was not protection. It was just another kind of loss, slower and more invisible and more thoroughly your own. Silas looked up and saw her watching him. He didn't startle. He just looked at her across the pasture. In the late afternoon, the mountains behind him, still carrying winter snow, at the upper elevations, the valley below doing its May thing, green and extravagant, and he said, "You going to stand there all afternoon, or are you going to help?" "I'm considering my options," she said. "Take your time," he said. She walked toward him. They finished the fence line together, which took another hour. Working in the practiced silence, that was one of the better things she'd discovered about long partnership, the kind of quiet that was not empty, but full of everything that didn't need to be said because it was already known. The light went from afternoon to evening as they worked. That specific Montana transition when the mountains caught the last of it and held it against the dark, and the valley below them held the color for a few minutes after the sky had given it up. They came together at the place where their sections met, and Silas checked the join of it, tested the tension of the wire, checked the post she'd driven, and said, "Good," which was all either of them said about the quality of work, ever. Because if it wasn't good, they said so, and if it was good, that was sufficient. She looked at the fence line stretching in both directions. She thought about the first time she'd mended this fence, alone, early in the morning, when the light was flat and she was not in the mood for visitors. She thought about the sound of a horse going wrong on the road, the particular rhythm that made a horsewoman set down her tools. "Do you know what I think about sometimes?" she said. "Tell me," he said. "I think about what would have happened if I just looked up from the fence and decided it wasn't my business." He was quiet for a moment, looking out at the valley. "You weren't going to do that," he said. "How do you know?" "Because you'd already looked up," he said. "By the time you spoke, you'd been watching me for a while." He glanced at her. "I saw you looking." She looked at him. "You knew?" "I suspected," he said. "A woman who wasn't going to help would have gone back to her work." Mara processed this. "You could have said something." "I had a lame horse and I didn't know you," he said. "I wasn't going to open that way." She looked at him for a long moment. "You were always going to let me decide," she said. Not accusingly, just arriving at it. "Yes," he said. "Even that night in the barn, after I told you to stop coming by. Even then, you could have just," he said. "I couldn't have." He looked at her directly. "Mara, the only version of this that was worth having was the one where you chose it. I couldn't make you do that. I could only make it possible." She stood beside him at the fence line that they had both extended and repaired and maintained for years now, in the last light of the evening, with Clara's laughter audible somewhere from the direction of the house where Alma Greer was watching the children, so they could finish this section before dark, and she thought about the word possible. He had kept it possible. That was what he had done. He had not pushed, not pressured, not engineered a situation designed to produce a particular outcome. He had simply refused to disappear, and in refusing, had kept the door from closing all the way, and had left the choosing to her, and had trusted with the specific faith of someone who has decided to trust without a guarantee of return that she would eventually choose. She still was. "Silas," she said. "Mara," he said. "I think we should go in," she said. "Clara's going to talk Alma into a second supper if we don't stop her." "She probably already has," he said. "Then let's go see the damage." They walked back across the pasture together. In the evening light, the mountains dark against the sky behind them, the house warm and lit against the coming dark, the sound of Clara's voice carrying in the clear air, asking, insisting, negotiating, the particular music of a child who had never once doubted that the world was worth engaging with fully and without reservation. Mara did not know where that confidence had come from. She had not had it at 4. She had spent most of her adult life carefully not having it. But here it was in her daughter, native and unquestioned, and she thought, maybe this is what it looks like when someone grows up certain they are worth choosing. Maybe that was what they had built, the two of them, imperfect and argued over and thoroughly real, not a perfect home, not a perfect family, not any of the shapes she'd been told to want or told to stop wanting. Just a place where the door was rarely locked and the fire was kept going, and the people inside it were not required to be anything other than what they were. She thought about the 24-year-old through the cabin wall. She thought about what she would say to her if she could. Not that it would be fine, not that it would work out. Those were the easy promises, the ones that cost nothing, because they were made from the far side of everything that made them possible. She would say, the future you are grieving is not the only one available to you. She would say, stop deciding what you cannot have before anyone has finished asking. She would say, the most dangerous thing you will do in your life is not the hard winters or the failed crops, or the people who want to take what you've built. The most dangerous thing is the closed door you maintain yourself, for years, against the very thing you need. But the 24-year-old would have to find that out the same way she had, by living it, by making the mistake, and then, when someone refused to let the door close all the way, choosing to open it. That was the only way. Silas held the gate for her, the gate he had fixed 18 minutes, the first time he came to her property, now solid and true and maintained with the careful attention of a man who understood that small things, kept in good repair, made the difference between a life that held and one that didn't. She walked through it. He latched it behind them. They went inside together, into the noise and light and complete ordinary, irreplaceable life that was waiting for them, and the door, as always, was left unlocked behind them, which was not a metaphor, and was also entirely one, and which was, as Mara Ellsworth had finally come to understand, fully and without reservation exactly the right way to live.